So today's focus is on data migration, which I guess we've kind of been building up towards in the previous two sessions. So the first one was on data prep, kind of strategies around how you can prepare for a migration. Second one was cleanliness. And today's one is around the actual migration itself and some steps you can take. And then we'll run through a couple practical things, issues you might run into, and some actually go through a data upload as well. For those, I'll just run through it briefly again for those who don't know me. So my name's Sam, originally from New Zealand, which you'll probably hear from the accent. I worked for 2 years as an end user of Salesforce as a customer service representative. Worked then at that same company as an accidental admin, kind of fell into the role, and then have since moved over to Germany and worked 2 years as a Salesforce consultant, working with big financial institutions over here. And then recently have founded my own company, DataImporter.io, to help people with, as it kind of says, importing data into Salesforce. Cool. So what is involved in a data migration? Because I think this part is probably the most overlooked part. You kind of think, a data migration is just getting data into or out of Salesforce. But actually, that's only one. I kind of like to break it down into three parts. One is the actual, there's some parts beforehand, which we've kind of already discussed, right? The prep and the cleanliness. But in terms of the actual migration itself, I kind of like to break it up into a few steps as well. So one of those is the actual processing of the job, right? So the actual going through using a data loader or some other tool to actually import that data. The second one is the testing of that and then doing some analysis. And the third step is rollback and rollout. And I'll kind of run through each of those, but maybe just a quick summary. So processing is pretty straightforward. Like I said, actually doing the job. Testing and analysis is more around checking that what you expected to happen has happened. And rollback and rollout is about communication with people, how you can let them know whether something's gone right or wrong, and the steps that you can take to kind of reverse things when they do go wrong. So jumping right into it. One of the things which you will probably have encountered if you haven't already in your career, and especially if you're dealing with data, is vlookups in Excel. They're basically what vlookups are is a way for you to connect different data sources, essentially. So if you think of it in the Salesforce world, you have maybe accounts and contacts. If you think of those as two different sheets in Excel, you could do a VLOOKUP to kind of link the accounts and contacts, like you can create a lookup relationship in Salesforce. So that's what they're kind of used for. But there's some kind of gotchas that you have to be careful of if you're going to be using them for your data loading. And one of the main things is that they're not case sensitive. So I'll show you an example actually opening up Excel here. You should be able to see this Excel sheet, right? Cool. So what I have here is I have one table of data here and then a second table down the bottom. So the first table here is essentially just some dummy account data. Pretty straightforward. I've got account name, email, website, owner name, and I've got this ID, right? And this is the ID as it would appear if you created a report in Salesforce, right, of accounts, downloaded the report as a CSV, you would get these IDs here. In Salesforce, I'm not sure if you know, but Salesforce actually has two different types of IDs. They have a 15-digit ID, which is what these ones are, and they also have 18-digit IDs, right? And this is an example of where using the 15-digit IDs can go wrong pretty quickly. So what I have here is I have this table of data, and let's say I'm wanting to do an import, and I have the IDs, and I just want to get the account names, right? What you would kind of expect to happen, so I've just copied these 4 IDs here, and they match the exact same 4 IDs here. And if you actually look at the difference, the only difference is in these last 6 characters. So the top one has GHIJKL, all in lowercase. This one is the first three uppercase, second three lowercase, et cetera, right? It's the same characters, just different cases. And it's the same over here. But when I write this vlookup function, what it's actually doing, and this is kind of an Excel standard thing, is it doesn't look at the case of the characters, it just looks at the combination of the characters. And so if you were going to rely on this kind of method to link different data and then use it for your import, it's just going to find the first match, right? It's essentially viewing these four as duplicate values. And when it does the VLOOKUP, it's just going to find the first match that it finds. In this case, it's the first record. So if you imagine you are importing some accounts and some contacts, for example, in this case, you wanted to link the contact to the account, this would obviously not give you the expected result, right? The expected result would be that it's kind of finding the correct one. So the easiest way around that is to use the second type of ID that I mentioned, which is the 18-digit IDs. And what that does is basically the first 15 characters are the exact same, and then it puts on 3 random characters to the end of it so that the 18-digit IDs are completely unique. Doesn't matter about the case. And Salesforce literally just, so the Salesforce originally just had these 15 character IDs because their internal database system basically uses these as their unique identifier, and quickly ran into a problem because lots of companies, especially back in the day, and even still, are using Excel for data analysis, reporting, etc. We're realizing that there's this VLOOKUP function in Excel wasn't working. And so that's one of the main reasons actually why they added in this 18-digit ID, which is unique for Excel. And so the next question is obviously, how do I get this 18-digit ID? There's a few ways you can do it. So one is if you do an export from Salesforce, sorry, as opposed to downloading a report, that will have those 18-digit IDs in there, right? So if you use like data loader, export some records, and you select ID as a column, it'll give you the 18-digit ID as opposed to the 15 one. Another way is you can create a field on the object itself. I'll link the documentation to this for the notes, but basically you can create a formula field on each object that you need the 18-digit ID to kind of populate it automatically. And then the final way, which is if you're just kind of looking to get individual 18-digit IDs, there's a pretty easy way. If you go to any record in Salesforce, right? So if you've got a dev org, then you'll be used to seeing this Edge Communications account because it's there on all of them. If you look up in the URL, you'll actually see this bar here. And this is the 18-digit ID, right? So if you want to find the unique 18-digit ID for any record in Salesforce, it'll always be present in this URL here. So it's whether it's contacts, opportunities, whatever, any custom objects that you've created, you'll be able to find this ID here. But for kind of bulk uploading processes, the best way is going to be to export it basically to get those IDs or create a field. But you obviously have to do that on every single object that you need the 18-digit ID for. So yeah, that's just kind of the easiest way to show how these these VLOOKUPs can go wrong pretty quickly. And that is why I try and recommend that people avoid using them if you don't need to, right? So if you don't have a requirement that you need to do these matchings in Excel, then I recommend people don't do it because things like this can go wrong. And it's often, you don't get an error message from Excel, right? Saying, oh, this lookup has found multiple records or anything. It's just going to link it. So it's quite obvious to see if you have 4 records and you can see, oh, it's pulling the same account. That doesn't look right. But imagine if you have 500,000 accounts in here and they're all in different orders. There's no real easy way to check, right? And you're just leading yourself down a path of errors, basically. So try and avoid them where you can. And yeah, like I said, figuring out what's gone wrong is often difficult because you don't really get any, unless you've actually done the syntax of the formula wrong, Excel isn't going to give you any errors or warnings saying that, you've got, you've found multiple lookups or anything like that. Cool. Auto-populating values. So this is basically a feature in Salesforce where certain fields will be filled and generated by Salesforce automatically. So if you're doing an import of accounts, for example, and I'll jump in and show you this practically in a second, but if you're doing an import of accounts and you fill in all the required fields, you fill in the account name, the website, email, whatever it might be, there's actually some other required fields which you don't need to populate because Salesforce will populate them themselves. And so a couple examples are the owner and the record type, right? So when you're importing data and you don't explicitly give or tell Salesforce, this is the owner of the person, by default, it'll be you. So whoever's doing the import will become the owner. Or if you have any processes built in Salesforce, like lead assignment rules or case assignment rules, for example, then the owners will kind of be distributed automatically. So even though owner is a required field, right? Like every record in Salesforce has to have an owner, you don't have to tell Salesforce who that owner is. And the same goes for record type. So it'll essentially just give you a default record type. Now this can be good, right? It means in one way, you don't always have to populate these values when you're doing an import or an update, but it can also be kind of dangerous and a little bit messy. For example, it's quite often the case that when you're doing an import, you don't have the owner column and you just let the import run as yourself. You just have to remember things like, okay, so I'm going to be the owner of these records in Salesforce. How is the sharing or the visibility set up, right? Will all the people who actually need this data be able to see it because now I'm the owner of this data? And if I'm listed as a system admin at a high level and I've got visibility set to private, for example, then maybe the people who actually need to see this data won't be able to see it. So that's why, again, it's something I would recommend that you populate these values when you can. So if you have the information of the owner of the record type, for example, that you explicitly tell Salesforce what those values should be, and you don't just let Salesforce kind of decide that for you. You can obviously set the defaults within Salesforce, but it's not always going to fit with the defaults with what you're doing. So I would always recommend that you, just explicitly tell Salesforce what you want to do. Cool. Another thing to keep in mind is the lookup relationships, right? So similar to what we were talking about with using vlookups in Excel, you can obviously link, if you're importing contacts, for example, as the import's happening, you can essentially link those contacts to accounts or whatever custom object or whatever other object you need to link. If you're using the standard Salesforce data loader, you basically have to give the ID of that field to Salesforce, or in some cases, so if you're doing an upsert, for example, you can give it in any external ID field. But what you can't do is if you have a list of contacts and the name of the account, you can't tell Salesforce using the standard data loader to say, okay, look up the account by the name and then link them like that. So you have to get the IDs, and that's where just making sure that you're using those unique IDs is really important, because otherwise you might get unexpected results. And also you might not even get an error back from Salesforce if it's just linked 5 contacts to one account when it should have been to 5 different accounts. And that's where, again, I'll talk about the testing and how you can kind of check and validate that stuff. One of the things with lookup relationships is they're very hard to undo and to fix, especially if you have like a really complicated data structure in Salesforce where you might be, I don't know, importing every day 5 different objects and they all have to go in order and they're all kind of related to each other. So you might have like households, and each household has accounts, each account has different products, and each product have transactions, for example. If you have some kind of complex process like that and you make the lookups go wrong at some stage of the process, it's a very time-consuming thing to fix, right? Because all of those things are just going to flow down the chain, essentially. So yeah, making sure that you're doing these lookups right the first time is obviously pretty helpful. And again, they can also affect things like data visibility. So if you have sharing, so an example would be you want to insert some tasks onto accounts, right? And the tasks visibility is set to the parent, right? So if you have visibility of the account, you can see the task. If you're linking tasks to different accounts or to the wrong accounts, that can obviously affect who can see what data. So I'll show you a brief example of how you can kind of do these text-based lookups, because that's one thing which tools outside of Data Loader have kind of tried to solve, and I'll use my product as an example of that, is that you can use text values to kind of query and get the IDs for you automatically, as opposed to having to do an export and then a vlookup and then match them together and then do that. It's kind of cutting those steps. It doesn't necessarily need to be my product. Obviously, a lot of these kind of data loading tools can do this, and it's just one of the best ways to save time and kind of not have manual work for yourself. Cool. So let's run through a couple of jobs here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert some accounts, and then I'm going to insert some contacts and basically link those two records together. So we'll go through here pretty quickly. I'm going to insert using an Excel as a source. And so I can choose my file. I'll use this vlookup example file that I have. And it's the account object. So I'll go to mapping. Cool. So what do I want to map? So for this example, I'll just keep it pretty straightforward. I'm just going to have name and website, right? So the name of the account and the website. That's it. So for the accounts, I'm not too fussed. Don't need to clean the data. I'm happy with it. Can have a quick look. It looks all good, and I will submit it. Cool. It shouldn't take too long because we just have 4 accounts here. We can have a look. It says it's successful, and we can have a quick check in Salesforce. We've got some accounts, right? Account 1 looks like the right name. It's got the right website, right? Looks pretty straightforward. So now what I'll do is I will insert some contacts. I can use the same file because I have enough information in there to do that. Okay, and we've got contact here. Can have a look at the mapping. Cool. So what does this do here? So in the file, I've got this last name column, and I'm going to map that to last name on the contact object, right? Because that's a required field that I always have to populate. I've got email in there as well. That's all good. And normally, if you're wanting to link these contacts to accounts, you would have to have the account ID in here, right? And you would have to select account ID. So that's what you would do if you're using the standard data loader. You would have an account ID column. But what you can do in here is I also have this account name column, right? Which in our case is that account 1, 2, 3, 4, which we've just created. And what you can do is you can say, okay, Salesforce, I want you to look up the accounts using the account name field. And what that does is basically in the background does an export of those accounts records with the name and the IDs and automatically fills those IDs in for us. I also have done the same for owner as well. So normally you would have like an owner ID, which is the user ID in Salesforce. But here I just have the name, right? So a pretty common use case is like a sales rep or someone in ops might give you a list of contacts and the owner, right? But it's probably going to be just the owner name. So this is a way that you can quickly, as opposed to, again, having to do an export, vlookup, and go through those steps, you can just say, okay, just look up the name in Salesforce. And if it has one, then populate it. I can go to preview. So again, if we have a look, we've got the account name in here, the email address, the owner name. So again, I've got myself and another one as an example, and the last name is populated, and I can go submit. And we can run that. It'll take a little bit longer because it needs to also query that data. But what we will hopefully see if it works, and if it doesn't, then I've got some testing to do, is if we have a look in Salesforce at some of these contacts, right? So it says view successful. So in the success file, you'll now see there's all these IDs that have been populated automatically. And I have a look, if I have a look at one of them in Salesforce, So this is on Smith 2. We can see it's linked to account 2, right? So it's found the right account automatically just based on the name value. So this is just one way, I guess, that you can kind of, and you can also see the owner lookup has been found, right? Based on the name. And you can basically do this for any relationship. So you can do it for record type. So if you just have the name of the record type called, business account or prospect or whatever it is, you can do those lookups as well. Whereas normally, I guess, what I was kind of doing previously when I was working as an admin was, exporting records, vlookups, and stuff went wrong, right? We had something like 300,000 accounts in there, did a vlookup wrong, matched to the wrong accounts, but Excel didn't give me an error, didn't update in the sandbox, checked some stuff, looked all good, did it in prod, realized that 50,000 or so were wrong, and I was going to have a late night fixing all of that data. So yeah, any way you can make your lives easier for yourselves, I would definitely suggest doing that. Cool. So there's a lot more kind of gotchas, but I would say these are some of the main ones to kind of watch out for. Again, there's an article which I'll link in the notes, which has kind of a list of the most common ones, what they mean, and what you can kind of do about them to fix them. Cool. So we move on now to testing a migration. Right, so we've run our jobs. We're pretty happy with how things are gone. And then we want to test. And so by test, I don't mean testing before you've done it, but testing the results, right? So validating that everything has gone the right way. So again, so I would check the stuff that you've done in the sandbox, like I mentioned, make a list of some of the manual steps that you need to do. So quite often when you're doing some sort of migration project, especially if it's an existing Salesforce instance and maybe you're connecting a new data source, you've created some new custom object that you're wanting to populate, there's going to be some manual steps involved that you need to do. So a quick example is you're adding some new values to a pick list field, right? And what you normally have to do is you basically have to activate those values so that Salesforce will accept them. And that's kind of a manual step that you might need to go through. Maybe you need to assign some permission sets to some users so that they can view these new objects, or you need to update profiles, whatever it might be. Quite often when you're doing a migration, there's some manual steps involved. So as you've gone through your sandbox testing, just make sure you're making a list, writing down all these steps, because it's really easy to just forget assigning a field to someone, checking a box in a profile, whatever it might be. And that can just kind of put a block in your whole migration. So yeah, I would just say make a list of the steps and then just follow them as you're going through in production. It'll make your lives a lot easier. Spot check the data. So even if you're doing a really small import, like I just did there with the accounts and contacts, just open up a couple of the records, have a look in Salesforce. Do these look right? Again, match your source data file with what is actually in Salesforce now and just check if things are kind of looking as expected. One thing to remember there, though, is like I discussed in one of the previous sessions, that if you have processes in Salesforce which are firing after these imports are happening, that the data might have updated, right? So if you have like a workflow rule or a process builder or flow or whatever it might be, that's updating these records after an insert happens in Salesforce, for example, or after the records are created, the data might look completely different. Like you might have a workflow rule where if an account is imported and the owner name equals Sam Hoult, then set the email value to invalid as an example, right? And then you've got your source file, it has proper emails, you run your job, it looks all good, you click on the records and then it says invalid in there, right? You're not going to see any error messages because the process has worked as it should, but just remember that when you're spot checking data, you should be thinking about what's actually happening to that data when it's in Salesforce as well. And one thing which I would just add here is use if your company has kind of allowed it, you can use the functionality to log in as another user at this stage. especially if you're importing data on another user's behalf or a different team, to check, can they actually see this data, right? You can obviously check like the sharing, the visibility settings, making sure that they have all the permissions and stuff. But again, it's easy to kind of miss over a step. So yeah, if you have the ability to log in as another user, you can use that here just to check, okay, if I search for this account, does it pop up, for example? And again, another one which I think is kind of overlooked, and what I definitely wasn't doing at the very start of my career, is creating reports or metrics for a successful migration. So to be able to test whether a migration has worked successfully, you'll obviously check, did I get any errors back from Salesforce? Does the data look as I would expect in Salesforce? But especially if you're doing really big imports using lots of data, there's only so many spot checks you can do, right? Like, for example, the import that I talked about, we had like 300,000 accounts that I was updating. 50,000 of them are wrong. I think I went through and checked like 5 to 10 or something, and they all just happened to be right. Of course, that's how it goes. So if you've got like if you only have 5, right, you could, if you wanted to, just go through and check all 5. But I would always recommend building some sort of report or metric to kind of validate that migration has happened as expected. So one example would be you're inserting 50,000 contacts, right? And you know that those are roughly split up between the different sales reps. Maybe you have 10 sales reps on your team, and you've communicated with the manager in that team, and they've said, yeah, it's not exactly 5,000 each, but each team member should have about the same amount. One report which you could create before the migration would be contacts grouped by owner, right? And you can get a summary of that and see, okay, maybe I have 1,000 contacts in there currently. This is the distribution. You run the migration, you do some spot checks, looks all good. You can go back into that report now and kind of validate the assumption that you had that they should be evenly spread out between the sales reps. So if you go in there and you look and you see, okay, one sales rep has 40,000, 3 have 3,000 each, and there's 6 sales reps that don't have anything, something's probably gone wrong. Now, it could just be that the data they gave you was bad. It could be that there was a miscommunication, or something else has happened in Salesforce. But unless you actually have these reports and you've had these discussions and you're kind of doing before and after checks at a wide view, you're never really going to know these things. So that's where I would, again, just, try and kind of cover things off for yourself, create reports, have some sort of metrics. Like maybe it's another metric you might have is we want to have at least 75% of our contacts with an email address loaded, right? And you do your account import and you notice that it's gone from 82% down to 64%, right, of your total contacts that have an email address, or that you've probably forgotten to map an email address, or the file had lots of invalid email addresses, or whatever it might be. There's no kind of general rule on what report or what metric is going to work, because it's obviously dependent on your data. So just have a think what is appropriate, talk with the different people in the business about how they want to measure a successful migration. Cool. Let's say we've gone through all that stuff, we've tested, we've validated, we're happy. How do you actually roll out a migration? It's kind of a weird thing because, if you've done the import, the data is kind of there, right? So you might think, put a check on it and kind of move on to the next thing. But again, this is a really important step to be able to communicate with all of the users. And one thing which I would recommend is kind of throughout this whole planning phase, testing phase, and migration phase, that you actually communicate with all users in the organization, not necessarily in the organization, but all of the Salesforce users, not necessarily just the ones who this data is directly affecting, right? So if we use the same example, the contacts with the 10 sales reps, don't just email the 10 sales reps that you're going to be importing these contacts at this time, because if you link them to the wrong accounts and suddenly another team is involved and they're suddenly seeing contacts appearing on their accounts, it's just, they're gonna not have any idea what's kind of going on, right? So it's just easier to kind of communicate with all of the people who could be affected by this data. If it's irrelevant for them, they can kind of ignore it. but at least it's there and they're aware that something's going on. Again, and that helps with the timeline and if there's any outages. And so by outages, I mean, normally for like a big migration, you'll kind of do it after hours or maybe on the weekend even. So what I would suggest is that you communicate this to people. You say, okay, Friday, 5 p.m., 6 p.m., whatever it might be. No one should be entering any data into Salesforce because this is when we're doing our data migration. You can actually technically lock them out if you really wanted to take it that far, but at least you can communicate it to them so that if they come on Monday, they don't say, why is the account I created on Friday night gone, or I was working on the weekend, because you've communicated to them, right? Whereas if you don't communicate that and you just talk with your one team or just your direct manager or whoever it might be, and there's something unexpected that happens, then yeah, it's just a bad look basically if you haven't communicated that to them. Another one I see, which is one that I kind of learned the hard way, is, and how I found out about that error that I'd done with the accounts back when I was working as an admin, was that users will find the errors, right? I kind of talked about this previously, but whenever you do something wrong with data in Salesforce, it's really easy to spot, especially if it's some relationship that's gone wrong, some, the formatting of the data is wrong, whatever it might be. If something goes wrong, like the users are just going to come and hound you, right? You kind of can't hide away from it. So just be proactive. I think it shows a lot of respect, and they'll respect you a lot more if you're kind of proactive to say, at 6 p.m. we were due to do this migration. At 6:30 it was completed. At 7 p.m. we saw during our testing and validation, we've seen that there's an error. We are going to correct it, and you give them kind of regular updates, as opposed to thinking, oh, I'll come in on Monday morning and quickly fix it before anyone notices, because people will notice. So again, it's just a thing to kind of make yourselves look better and for people to respect you more, that you're kind of owning up to errors, because they will occur at some point. And that's where just saving your results and your analysis in an organized way really helps. So if you're using the standard data loader, for example, you get two files whenever you run a job. You get a success file and an error file. And they don't give you any information on the file name. It literally just says success underscore a random number.csv, and it says error underscore random number.csv. So if as part of your testing, you've done 20 jobs, right? Kind of uploading, deleting, changing things, blah, blah, blah. You're going to have a lot of success and error files. And it just makes your life way easier if you keep these in some organized way. So one way might be you create a folder for each different org you have. You might have like a sandbox folder, testing folder, production folder, and you go on and rename those files, right? So you go and rename them. This is the success job for the account import done at XYZ time, and it was going into production. I'll put that into the production folder. And that's really going to save you so much time that you're not kind of having to go in to each file, double check things. Again, that leaves you the opportunity to do things wrong, to pick up the wrong job that was run. And that kind of brings me on to the next point here, is rolling back a migration, right? So what do you do when things go wrong? If you've got that information in a really unorganized, it's just sitting in a downloads folder on your computer, and you've got 100 different files, it just leaves you open to having more issues. So the first thing you obviously need to do when you have realized that something's gone wrong is understand the root cause of the issue. Don't immediately assume that it's something to do with the actual migration process. I would say it's probably just as common that something on the Salesforce side of things isn't working as expected, whether that is a process that is, like I mentioned, kind of firing in the background, a flow, a process builder, whatever it is, updating that data. Maybe you have a difference in between sandbox and production. So when you tested in sandbox, worked all smoothly because the flow wasn't activated, but in production, the flow is activated. And that's just caused you some errors. And another one is data quality. So if you're getting this data from another person or another system, and maybe the files that you were given for the sandbox were testing files with dummy data, and then you get, which is a pretty common thing, and then you get a production file with production data, and it's just dirty data, right? The cleaning steps that you needed to do in the sandbox didn't fit, and now you've got some kind of mismatch. That's another pretty common cause of what's gone wrong, but you really need to understand what's gone wrong before you know how to correct it. Cool. So basically in the planning stage, you should have come up with a plan of what to do when things do go wrong. Some of which might include deleting data, removing visibility of records, right? So if you've just been updating records and you've updated it to the wrong owner, for example, and now people can see stuff that they shouldn't see, you could go through and delete that stuff, but that's obviously quite a drastic move because you're going to lose all the history of the records. So one way you could kind of go around that is by removing visibility for records. That's kind of one step you could look to take. Cool. And I would also suggest performing the rollback in the sandbox first. So if you've done testing in a sandbox and you're pretty confident that the sandbox matches production and it worked fine in the sandbox, you've done the job in production and it didn't work, as opposed to just doing the rollback straight away in production. If you have time, and I would always suggest that for something like this, you make time, I would do the rollback in the sandbox first. So if you have to delete lots of records that you just inserted, I would delete them first in the sandbox, figure out what's going wrong there, correct it in the sandbox before you actually roll it back in production. Because what you might discover is that deleting the data, for example, isn't actually going to solve the issue. It's a sharing and visibility issue. And if you go ahead and delete all the accounts in production straight away as kind of a panic strategy, and then you realize, oh, I didn't actually need to delete them, then you just have to go through the whole process again. Whereas maybe you do just delete the records in the sandbox and then realize, oh, okay, I didn't actually need to delete these records. I just missed this checkbox or I forgot to assign a permission set. So again, I would just suggest using the sandboxes for what they are, and that is testing stuff before you do it directly in production. And that applies for fixing mistakes as well. And again, I would just suggest using third-party tools to help you in this part of the step. So whether it's a tool like the Salesforce backup and recovery, which has kind of been reactivated again by Salesforce, where you can, it's basically like a backup solution that you can kind of reactivate your data. It will save copies of your data on like a daily schedule, for example. And if you do something wrong, you can always go back to the previous day. There's heaps of third-party tools that can do that as well. So the most popular one is probably Own Backup, which is actually a relatively like inexpensive solution for what it provides. And then for the actual importing itself, so that's something which I've kind of tried to build into my product, and I'll show you just a really quick example of how you can do that. So let's say as part of these jobs that I've run, right, I go onto the context job here, and I've realized that I've forgot a mapping, or I've did a vlookup in Excel first and the owner's name was all wrong, or whatever it might be, right? You can just come and click roll back the job. And what that will do is just undo that import that you've just done, right? You don't have to then like export the files, kind of do some more analysis. It'll just, whatever you've inserted, it'll just delete it for you. And that's how like, yeah, using these tools can kind of give you a bit more safety, a bit more confidence that if you do make mistakes, there's kind of some built-in solutions for you to do that. Cool. So the summary. So again, communication is really important as part of this step. You don't just communicate the kind of plan of what the migration is. You should communicate the actual execution of that plan and anything that's gone right or wrong, right? So if you get something wrong, communicate that to the people. If you get something right, communicate that as well, right? Just say, hey, look, migration went well. The testing was as expected and the data is available for you to use. Be careful of using manual steps in Salesforce automating data. So again, if you're going to be doing any kind of Excel work, get someone else to check over it, right? There was a quick step which I could have done in the previous role, I guess, as a accidental admin, it wasn't my official title. I was kind of wearing many hats and doing multiple jobs. And so there was no one else in the organization who had any real Salesforce skill or knowledge. And so there was no one I could kind of lean on to do those checks, but definitely the stuff in the Excel stage. I was working at a financial institution, so there was lots of people with Excel skills. Could have got someone just to have a look over the data, right? And maybe they would have noticed that the VLOOKUP formula I had done was incorrect, and it would have saved me a lot of hassle. So just get someone to check over things and just be careful of Salesforce automating those steps like record types and owners, because yeah, it might be helpful in the sense that you don't have to do it yourself, but it can also give you kind of unexpected results. Utilize tools to make your life easier. So like third-party tools on the App Exchange, Salesforce themselves have some third-party tools which can help test and analyze after the processing is done and save the results. And so I should make it clear there, save them in a logical, clear, you'll remember this tomorrow kind of way, so that if you do have to roll something back or test something, it's going to be a lot easier for you to find exactly what you've done. Test the rollout and the rollback. Don't make things worse. It's really easy to kind of panic and just quickly undo something. Oh, I've just inserted these, let's just delete them quickly because they're all wrong. Unless you're kind of 100% sure that deleting them will resolve the problem, just take your time, have a think about what the steps are that you actually need to take, and test that rollback again in like a sandbox or a testing environment before you do it in production, because you can easily just take yourself down a path. If you try and undo something that causes another error, you try and undo that causes another error. Cool. And that is kind of everything that we had planned for today. Let's have a look through some of the questions that people have posted so far. Cool. So we have a question. Is there any reason for the 15 versus 18-digit IDs?
Yeah, you answered that. So
sweet.
I said
no worries. Just to reiterate, it's just a Salesforce, their system. They have their own 15 unique IDs. That's what they started with originally back in the classic version, and very quickly realized that people were exporting stuff and doing it in Excel, which is a bit funny, right? Considering Salesforce is kind of meant to replace the Excel CRM system. So they added in the 18-digit one. Are the checks I'm referring to in the sandbox before the migration actually occurs? Yeah, it's a great point. So basically, as you're going through your planning phase, one of the steps is doing this whole process in a sandbox. It's going to depend on what kind of sandbox you have. So Salesforce basically offers you different types of sandboxes, one of which, when you create the sandbox, called the developer sandbox, there'll be no data in it whatsoever, right? So for a data migration project or implementation, I would never really suggest using a developer sandbox, because it's basic, the data structure is not going to be similar to production at all. And what you basically have to do is go through and create a manual data structure by yourself in the sandbox. And again, that just leaves room for errors. But Salesforce also offers partial and full copy sandboxes. So a partial copy will essentially take some 1,000 number of each record, of each object, sorry, and will populate that automatically for you as a copy of whatever is in production. And a full copy sandbox, which you'll quite often have to pay Salesforce for, or you can maybe just call your AE and ask for one, which they will most of the time give you, is a little tip. is, especially if it's for like a migration project or anything that's going to boost your usage and stickiness of Salesforce. So we used to do that all the time, especially when I was working as a consultant. If you just ask Salesforce, say, hey, we're doing this migration project, I only need this for 6 weeks or a month or whatever it might be, they'll most of the time just going to give it to you. But yeah, with a full copy sandbox, you essentially get a full replication of all of the data that you have in production. And with that, then you can do your full validation tests, right? So checking the ownership, checking the record types, the amount of data, all of that stuff. You can even build out all of your validation reports in the sandbox. And maybe as part of the migration, you deploy those reports so that they're the same in production as well. So you can kind of do a full copy. Cool. Next question is, when migrating data, is it typical to work on a team, or is it usually one person responsible for migrating the data? I would say that kind of depends on the organization that you're working for. So I can give you some of my experience, for example. When I was a accidental admin, or when I was an admin, basically the company size was, let's just say 100 employees, and of those maybe 40 to 50 Salesforce users. And I kind of had one person who was like in the customer support kind of team who knew the data really well, who I would kind of lean on to do spot checks of data, do some validation, does this look right? But in that organization, I was basically the one person responsible for actually doing it. When I've been working as a consultant and working with much larger companies, there's a lot more people involved. So in one way, it slows down the process, because you might ask IT has to do an extraction of the data. Someone else has to look over it. It's going to be saved in some secure storage somewhere that you have to then get access to. So in one way, it slows down the process, but it also means there's a lot more eyes looking at the data, checking things. So when I was in the consultant role, I had like a team of developers who I was working with who would do some spot checks. And as part of the kind of migration and the rollout, there was a lot of documentation which went on. So you would have to kind of go in and validate the results are what you expected. So definitely at large organizations, I'd say there's more than one person going to be touching it. Can we expect a lot of clients to be using Excel? Is that why you used it? I would say the answer is still 100% yes. So I'll be surprised if you find a company that doesn't use Excel in some way or another. They might not be using it as like a full-blown CRM, but maybe a lot of the salespeople, they're not logging notes in Salesforce, right? Even though they've been told that this is obviously the best way, you can connect to all your data and stuff. Don't be surprised if people are building their own charts and reports in Excel is another pretty common example. You might have siloed teams, right? So like the company that I was working at, for example, we didn't have everyone in the company on Salesforce. We had all the kind of customer facing people in the back office, people on Salesforce, but the investment team were not Salesforce users. So you might have siloed people, and one part of the company is using Excel and generating reports that you need to import into Salesforce. So yeah, I would say you should still really expect to be encountering Excel. So yeah, I would just kind of use it on the side as much as you can, get comfortable with doing things like validation, vlookups. As a Salesforce admin, it shouldn't be like a massive part of your role, but you're going to be encountering it at some point in time for sure. Cool. That is a good question. Did I have a sandbox available for testing? And would it have been useful? Do the number of records that will be impacted make a difference in what is best, partial or full? Yep, so for sure. So we did have a sandbox, but it was one of the developer sandboxes that was basically, we had just made some dummy data in there that we couldn't really fully test with. So again, because my issue wasn't with all of the 300,000 records, it was just with some of them. Of course, but by luck, when I ran it in the sandbox, I checked through most of them, if not all of them, and they were all fine, right? But the data in the sandbox didn't match what was in production. And so there was no way I could kind of test that error in the sandbox environment. Now, if it was a more kind of professional setup, shall we say, like if I had like a team of admins and I had a more functional Salesforce team, I definitely would have had or asked for like a full copy sandbox or at least a partial copy, so that we could have done a lot more testing and validation in those sandboxes and testing with some kind of real life data. So I would say the amount of data isn't, yeah, it's definitely important in terms of going for a developer sandbox versus a copy sandbox. But in terms of like full copy versus partial, it's more of like a process decision, I guess, because in reality, you probably like, I think it's 10,000 records per object, if I'm not wrong, for a partial copy sandbox. So you're not really going to hit that limit when you're doing any kind of spot checks, and that's enough data for you to do some validation with. It's more of a a company decision where they want to have a full live working copy sandbox. Some companies kind of use that as a bit of a backup strategy as well. Like if something goes wrong, I have this full copy sandbox, it's set to refresh once a month or whatever it might be. And if things go wrong, I kind of have that there. Whereas if it's a partial copy sandbox, you obviously can only back up the 10,000 records per object. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. The vlookup with the caps, I didn't know that. Oh my God, that's terrifying.
Yep. So it's this, yeah. So another, like with the Salesforce IDs, that's one where you obviously get caught up quite a lot, the 15-digit IDs, that is. But it's the same if you're wanting to look up like the account name or the contact name, right? Like if you have a John Smith with a capital J and a John Smith with a lowercase j, it's not going to recognize those as being unique, as unique values. So yeah, it can be a tricky one for sure.
Yeah, that's a big gotcha.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Does anyone else have any more questions? No? Going once? Going twice?
If you guys do think of any other questions, or at any kind of stage in the journey, if you have questions about data or Salesforce or whatever, you can email me. It's just sam@dataimporter.io, or if you have a look, find me on LinkedIn, Sam Hoult, happy to connect and yeah, share what I've learned along the way.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sam. These have been really great because I don't have experience in data migration, so it was good to know about these gotchas.
Yeah, no, happy to share my knowledge with everyone.
All right,
I just want to say thank you also, Sam. Masterclass, man, we definitely appreciate it.
Yeah, not a problem. Thank you for being here.
All right, bye everyone. Happy Monday.
See you later.